And here the quick answer is, of course, that federalism can be seen as an institutional solution to problems related to how to deal with territorially concentrated minorities that want more autonomy, but at the same time ensuring that their autonomy is actually efficient or efficiently governed. Of course, there are advantages and disadvantages in federalism and deciding for such a system that the primer also deals with. To list some of them, advantages, for instance, the fact that it actually has the potential to develop the capacity and the democratic responsibility at every government level. It might actually reduce the burden on central authorities. It might broaden the pace of power sharing as minorities can hold office at the regional level. They're not anymore a national minority in the regional level. It might actually encourage innovative and pragmatic approaches to policy development, inasmuch as regions might pioneer some innovative policies that would not be possible to be implemented at the national level. And it might allow for wider distribution of public resources. This, of course, with a big asterisk, because as we know, for instance, in Spain, some federal units, I'm half Spanish, some federal units that might be richer than others might resist this redistribution. But there are also a number of disadvantages, issues that policymakers need to bear in mind, also ideally before committing to such a reform process. And some of these are that you risk duplicating work between different levels of government. You risk having lack of coherence between different levels of government, especially if your institutional capacity is not that strong. You can have additional operating costs because operating a federal system is more expensive, even if only by a little. There are different studies on this, but it is more expensive than having a unitary state because you're creating different levels of government, so you need to create institutional frameworks at very different levels of government, and that costs money. Unless you have an agreed revenue sharing mechanisms, you actually risk increasing the inequality between different subnational units. There is also the issue of having the judiciary adopting a much more political role, as the judiciary will have to resolve disputes between the competence of different levels of government, which is usually dealt with by the judiciary and not by elected legislatures. You can have actually the exclusion of minorities even at the regional level when minorities are minorities also within their region, and they're not recognized as such and defended by either the central or the regional state. You can also strengthen local elites who misuse power, which I think, as far as I heard in the past 2 days and also before, is an issue in the Philippines. It's not only an issue in the Philippines, of course. Many other countries have this issue as well, but it is something that needs to be borne in mind. And ineffective governance as well might be increased because of lack of capacity. So these are some of the disadvantages, of course, that need to be borne in mind before actually deciding on a federal system. The third question is the how to establish a federal state. And here the primer divides between two things. First, the structure of a federal state, and then the substantive powers that the central state adopts vis-à-vis the sub-state entity. In terms of the structure, the primer explains three different issues. First, the boundaries of subnational units. And what are the criteria to actually decide on where the boundaries should lie? And there are many different factors that can contribute to this decision, including economic factors, or social-cultural factors, or even geographic factors, as might be the case here in the Philippines as well, or the political balance between different political powers within the different regions, or public opinion, or historic boundaries. And then, of course, there is the question of how much discretion does the constitution builder have to actually define those boundaries. And finally, should a constitution actually specify boundaries? In India, it's an interesting case because there was a lot of disagreement between different camps as to how to actually define boundaries. There were those that wanted to define the boundaries through communal grounds, and then there were those that wanted to keep the old colonial boundaries. And they decided to keep the old the old ones, but give Parliament the unilateral power to actually change those boundaries, which it has done, to bring them in more close harmony with cultural and linguistic boundaries. The second issue that this part of the primer deals with is institutions of subnational government. So, in a sense, the subnational units need to have workable structures of government that enable them to exercise the power they have. But then what needs to be decided is, do subnational entities also have their own legislative? Do they have their own judiciary like it happens in the US? And then how is that actually established in a legal framework? There are countries that have their own, where the subnational, where the sub-state entities do have their own particular constitutions, like it's the case in Canada or Argentina. There are some federal states where the subnational unit is actually regulated through the center, like in Nigeria or India, where they don't have their own constitutional frameworks. And there are others, which might be some sort of a middle way, where there are special statutes regulating how the relationship between the center and the subnational regions work, like is the case in Spain and Italy. These two latter ones are, of course, no federations, but they are quasi-federalist systems that work in many ways very similar to federations. And the third issue is the distribution of powers between the central and the subnational level. So which powers should be actually exercised at which level, and how do you distribute them? Do you have a list of competences? Does the central state have a list of competences, or are there several lists of competences? Do you have a list of concurrent powers? And if you have a list of concurrent powers, that is, powers that are shared by the central and the sub-state level, the Constitution also needs to specify who has the supremacy, or how do you decide what level has the power to actually decide on these issues that are supposedly to be decided by both levels. And the Constitution can also specify where residual powers lie, or not. And if you don't, you might actually give the Constitution some sort of flexibility to actually change over time and respond to how societies themselves change, which is an interesting issue, which I'm not going to go into right now. But maintaining a Constitution enough flexible, but not too much, is a big challenge, but it's a very important issue to actually keep the Constitution alive. And in terms of substantive powers, key issues that the Constitution might need to regulate in a federal system include constitutional supremacy, as I was saying before, but also constitutional amendment rules. Usually in a federal constitution, it is more difficult to amend the Constitution compared to ordinary laws. This is, of course, the case also for unitary states, but it's more difficult for federal states, especially when they have a second chamber that might have powers to actually veto amendments. How are subnational units going to participate in the national legislation and policy making through a bicameral legislature, and what powers will this bicameral system have, or this second chamber have? The primer further hints at the fact that scrutiny, oversight, and fourth branch institutions need to exist at the national level to actually be able to uphold the rule of law, protect the equality of individuals, and ensure that regional majorities do not abuse their powers. And it also talks about clauses that allow the federal government to intervene in the internal administration of sub-state entities to actually ensure democratic stability. But this, of course, needs to be coupled with limitations of these so-called emergency powers, sometimes by dividing these powers of intervention between different institutions. So you have the executive actually deciding to intervene in a sub-state entity, but then Congress might need to approve that as well. And then the primer goes into talking about fiscal federalism, the extent to which subnational units should have their own tax base and their own revenue-raising power. And there are, of course, many different ways of how to organize this. You can have full fiscal autonomy for state executives, which has some disadvantages. And it can increase actually economic deficiencies or tax shopping between different regions, or you can have increased economic disparities as a result of this. Or you can have a division of revenue-sharing powers between the central and the sub-state entity. Or you can have sharing of revenues whereby the sub-state entity has revenue-raising power, but then needs to redistribute part of those funds to other regions that might be poor, or other measures that help or that would assist the regional state to actually borrow money or get federal grants from the national entity. Finally, the primer on federalism also deals with alternatives to federalism, because there are alternatives to federalism. And these include, for instance, other forms of macro decentralization, which the primer calls quasi-federalism, as in having a confederation, which would not really apply to the Philippines, but just very briefly, where usually it's demanded by groups in federal systems that are seeking greater autonomy within the federal constitution without having the destabilizing effect of full independence. But there are also other macro decentralizing mechanisms like devolution, where you decentralize power without sharing sovereignty at the central level. Or you have regionalism, which is sort of a middle way between devolution and federalism. Or you have special autonomy or asymmetric autonomy, which is what you have in the Philippines right now. Another alternative would be stronger micro-decentralization or stronger local governments, which is also a form of federalism, or can be. And then you have, of course, non-territorial autonomy for those minorities that are not territorially concentrated, that might need to have some sort of proportional representation at the central state, but also some sort of veto powers that enable them to actually veto legislation, etc. And then, of course, you have secession, but I don't think that anyone in this room would want that. So, the constitutional assessment for women's equality. So what is it? It is a tool that actually helps users assess the constitutional text by understanding the implications that specific design issues have on women's equality. So in other words, what we realize is that usually it's really hard to read a constitution because it's a very long text, it's very difficult, written with this legal language, etc., at least for the average reader. Like myself a couple of years ago, perhaps you are very easy reading constitutions, but usually it's a rather hard thing to do. And the tool, what it does, it guides its users to get actually their fingers into the constitution, and before they know it, they'll have read the constitution. So when thinking about what the Constitution says about women's equality, the general answer is, well, you look at the equality provisions. But what the tool says is you have to look everywhere. And to give some examples, you might need to look at whether the Constitution uses gender-neutral language, or whether there's a right to reproductive health, or whether the participation of females in the legislature is actually recognized, or even in the judiciary. So this is a new methodology that we just came out with this year that enables non-specialist users, that is, either constitution builders that might not be very familiar with women equality issues, or women rights groups that might not be very familiar with constitutional design issues, to perform analysis of their constitutions and see whether there are gaps, where they are, and how they could actually amend those gaps via some of the examples that the tool provides. So the workbook on the right-hand side of the slide, and actually this workbook which I have here, so it's a physical thing. Well, everything that I talk about is very physical. Anyways, so there's an online version as well. That's what I was going to say. So there's a virtual version of this. It provides basically 55 questions. And now I'm surely not going to find the 55 questions. Here they are. So it provides 55 questions. These 55 questions correspond to 8 different chapters in the workbook that deal with different issues like values and principles, or economic and social rights, or legislature and elections, government, or actually implementation and enforcement. And the tool is structured the following way. So the 13 is the question number 13. So it states the question. It gives a short explanation of what the question is supposed to mean within a constitution. Then it gives some examples as to how different countries have dealt with these issues. And then afterwards, there's another page that I haven't included there. There are some spaces, 2 spaces specifically. One is to include your own findings while you're reading your constitution as to how your constitution might be responding to the specific issue at hand. And then there is another space for actions. Actions as to how to improve those clauses or those chapters in the Constitution which would follow from some of the examples that you might have read beforehand in the tool. So basically, the expected outcome is first to improve the quality of self-assessments of the Constitution, and second, to gain arguments, or for the target users to gain argument to actually change or reform their constitutional framework for more equality of women. So, well, up until now I've mainly talked about constitutional design issues. The Constitution Building Process program also deals with constitutional processes as such, as I was saying. And the constitutional process is much broader, as I was also saying, than the constitutional drafting alone. So this policy manual, which we produced together with the Netherlands Institute of Multi-Party Democracy, is one important example of a comparative and policy-oriented knowledge resource that should serve as a reference for political parties actually driving reforms throughout a constitution building process. So the basic assumption here is that an increasing acceptance of the fact that constitutions enjoy broader legitimacy the more inclusive they are, so the more representative and the more participatory. Political parties, especially when they represent political interests and views, do actually have a very crucial role to play in any of the phases of a constitutional reform process, from the preparatory phase, when you're preparing for a constitutional reform process, where the constitutional reform might be marred by tensions and a wide variety of views, and where political parties need to create the foundations, need to talk about the why and with what objectives you're actually undergoing a constitutional reform, but also what principles and procedures there are for undertaking such a reform process. But political parties are also very important in other phases, like the awareness raising and consultation phase, where the citizenry should be informed of what's actually going on. What are the issues that we are discussing, and how are we supposed to think about those issues? The third phase on content, deliberation and drafting, here actually the political parties need to negotiate, and they need to come up not only with the level of inclusion of the negotiations, so what kind of parties, what kind of groups, civil society groups should be included in the negotiations, what kind of input from legal expert, be it national or international, are we going to accept, or in what format, but also with some specific mechanisms that relate to the constitution building process, like deadlock breaking mechanisms. So how do, when political parties do disagree about issues, how do they break those deadlocks that are created in the discussion, mechanisms for consensus building, for feedback, and even for monitoring of the process. And finally, in the adoption and implementation phase, you have to translate whatever it says in the Constitution to subsidiary laws. And this is a very lengthy and sometimes a very sensitive process. But it is indispensable for actually the implementation of the Constitution. And political parties need to agree on this, but need also to monitor this implementation. So for all this, political parties need to be better prepared. But at the same time, parties need to be aware that constitutional reforms are not only about design issues, as we were saying before, but that they should also help balance competing short-term interests of key political actors with the long-term public good. And this is a very big challenge in most constitution building processes. So political parties can do this in three different capacities. First, as individual political parties. They combine their own private interests with partisan interests, so the party's interests, and public interests. And they do this in different ways, by raising awareness, by electing their representatives and communicating their party positions, and by monitoring progress. But also, they can act as members of inter-party dialogue platforms. And these dialogue platforms are usually very volatile and often very, very slow in yielding any results, but they are at the same time very indispensable to actually establishing the democratic rules of the game, in that they are able to build trust, they are able to build consensus for the reform process, but also on content issues. And finally, it's really interesting to see how political parties relate to other stakeholders, be it NGOs or any other groups that might represent different groups in society in any of the phases of the constitution building process. So the policy manual, which I also have here, so it's also a physical thing, and it can also be downloaded, of course, on our website, includes a number of case studies at the end of countries where political parties have had a crucial role in the constitution building process. And these cases include from Bolivia to Ghana to Zimbabwe, South Africa, and actually also Indonesia, Iraq, even Kenya, etc. I'm coming to the end. But I did not want to let pass the opportunity of telling you about the Admiral Dialogues on post-conflict constitution building, which is specifically what I am working on. So in 2014, the Constitution Building Program, in partnership with the University of Edinburgh, started organizing what is now called the Admiral Dialogues on post-conflict constitution building. These are annual events that bring together constitutional makers, constitutional experts, but also the international mediators from across the globe to share their experiences on a given topic. And we started by talking about interim constitutions and their role as peacekeeping, but also as democracy building tools. And after that, after the conference, we actually published the policy paper, which I also have over there, which actually deals with some issues of design issues, but also within the process of a post-conflict constitution building process and what role interim constitutions can play here. Last year's workshop dealt with constitution buildings in the broader political settlement process and issues of inclusion. So when and to what extent do you need inclusion in a political settlement after conflict to increase the legitimacy of both the process and the final constitution? And what we identified during the workshop is that there was a pretty big gap related to the sequencing between peace agreements and constitutional arrangements in the broader political settlement process. And we also looked at how inclusion might or might not mean the final success in reaching this sustainable peace, in reaching this final political settlement. So Christine Bell of the University of Edinburgh and myself, we've written this policy paper on this precise topic, which is going to be published in the next couple of weeks, where we look at 23 different cases of constitution building processes after conflict that actually have come to fruition, so where there has been a new constitution built. And we identified 4 different sequencing patterns and their advantages and disadvantages vis-a-vis the broader political settlement, but also the broader peace process. And we also came up or identified a number of trade-offs that stakeholders need to bear in mind when attempting to reach a political settlement. These trade-offs arise because of the fact that while the agreement between warring parties is actually necessary, a broader set of more principled commitments is required as well for constitutional effectiveness and for the rule of law to actually take root. Maybe I'm not going to go through every single trade-off, but just to give you some examples. For instance, you need to look at how to balance having broad participation with elite paths. Sometimes elite inclusion might need to be prioritized over broader societal involvement, but this needs to be balanced again with the need for legitimacy throughout the process. Or including spoilers. Sometimes you need to assess the consequences that come out of actually including or excluding spoilers, or who within the spoilers, because spoilers can be very different. There are many groups that can spoil a process in many different ways. There can be spoilers that are very destructive, where you cannot really, or that are not open to negotiations, where you might have to go to their own constituencies, and perhaps that's possible, or perhaps you can engage with them on some specific issues that they're interested in, and start negotiations through those issues. So, just very briefly, this year's Edinburgh conference will deal with sub-state constitution building in fragile and conflict-affected states, so cases like Somalia, but we also will look at the Bangsamoro Basic Law in the Philippines as an asymmetric constitutional framework, but we're always open to new themes, so if you can think of an issue of interest in the field of post-conflict constitution building, and this goes generally also for the themes of the primers or any other theme that might be of interest to you personally, please do let us know, do let me know either today or you can always write me an email and I'll be happy to receive it. Very finally, the ConstitutionNet website. I'm not sure whether we can actually go into the website. So it's just to show you where you can actually get all the publications that I've been talking about, as well as a lot of other information. It doesn't matter actually, if you go to the presentation, then I can just explain.
Thank you.
No, that's fine. So anyways, the Constitution building website is constitutionnet.org. We feature 4 pieces, which we call pieces from the field, where authors from the different countries tell us about different issues in their own constitution building processes. We also have a news website where we actually collect different news of constitution building processes throughout the world. So it might be interesting to look into those as well. We just had a few articles on the Philippines precisely because we just decided to have a constitutional assembly, which is of course a very interesting thing to us. If you go to thematic publications, when you try at home, of course, you might see that we have different kinds of products, and not only those that I have presented to you today, but many other products on different issues, as well as the primers and the guide, etc. So please just surf around. If you have any questions, always get back to me. That's my email address, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions immediately should you have them. Thank you very much for your attention.